Okay, so I'm going to give an example of a competition that happened actually in the Great Lakes area, including Lake Ontario. And that was actually let me just close that there, a type of mussel. So it's kind of the situation I was describing before. So what happened is, so first of all, there are mussels that live in the Great Lakes naturally. Okay, so actually they're called pearly mussels. But what happened in the early 1990s, way before you were born, what happened is a ship that actually, so just so in case you don't know, so as a ship kind of moves across the water, it takes water into the under part of the ship. And that's part of what it naturally does. And typically when ships dock, they let all of the water that had come in out. So what happened is, what they believed happened anyways, is in the early 1990s in Lake Erie, a ship that had made its way in basically let out the water that it had taken in as it was moving. And then along with it, the water, a zebra mussel came out, or probably more than just one. But that's kind of how it was first introduced into the Great Lakes system. So, you're probably thinking, well, why is that such a big deal? Okay, well, first of all, it began to have a competition for the mussel with the same mussel that lives in the Great Lakes. So, meaning they eat the same food, they need the same habitat. But the difference is, and the main thing that is the biggest impact when you have an invasive species, is they have no natural predator. Okay, so what that means is there is nothing that is there to eat them. And you're probably wondering, well, why can't the thing that eats the pearly mussel also eat the zebra mussel or also eat the invasive species? So part of the problem is it's almost like, imagine you've eaten the same type of food that you've always eaten your whole life. Okay, so let's say you like eating, I don't know, like 5 different things. You like, chicken and pasta and I don't know, you eat the same 5 things every day of your life. And then all of a sudden somebody brings in this weird thing you've never seen before. Let's say you're eating, let me give an example. So what did I say? Pasta. Let's say you eat pasta, chicken. You like eating cereal, milk, and bread. Okay, and all of a sudden somebody's gonna bring a crab in front of you, like a cooked crab, and say, okay, why don't you eat this thing? Start eating this new type of food. Your body is gonna say, well, I have no idea what this is. I'm not gonna put that in my mouth. I don't know if it's safe to eat. I don't know what it tastes like. So it's kind of the same thing. Like the predators that are in that environment, they've never seen that mussel before in their life. They're not going to start, if you see something you've never seen before in your life, your first thing is not to like put it in your mouth and eat it, right? So what ends up happening is, because these invasive species don't have any natural predators, they basically are able to reproduce at a very rapid rate. So they continue reproducing, because there's nothing there to control that population. They continuously will reproduce. So what started happening? Well, there were so many zebra mussels that they began to harm not only natural habitats of ecosystems that are there, of the organisms that were already there naturally, but actually they started harming human activity that's in the Great Lakes as well. So there's a lot of pipes that lead into the lakes. So imagine like from the sewer system and different types of industries. So what was happening is there was so many mussels that they were basically starting to go on the inside of these pipes, both inside and outside. But the problem was the inside started to become blocked. So that's when kind of everyone started waking up and saying, okay, I think these mussels are probably going to be a bit of a problem here. We need to do something to try and limit their populations. Now, over time, okay, there's a couple of things that can happen when there's competition. Before I get into that. So when you have competition, Okay, there's kind of two outcomes that can happen. So one thing that can happen is one of the species will win. One species wins. Okay, so what I mean by winning is that essentially they will stay in that ecosystem, and the other species that does not win or that loses will have to either move to a different ecosystem, or you're going to have one of them die out. So one species wins and the other leaves, right? So meaning they'll have to move on and go to a different ecosystem. But if they're not able to leave, what will happen is one species will die, or their population will decrease dramatically. Okay, so when you have competition is not really good for either species that's involved. It's kind of a negative impact for both of them. But essentially, something has to occur. So either one of the species will win or the other species will decrease. So actually what happened in the Great Lakes is the natural mussel that was found there decreased in the population to the point where it's still there today. We do still have pearly mussels in the Great Lakes, but they're in very low population numbers. So the next part of this, I'm going to show you the food web that the zebra mussel made its way into. So as I mentioned, so one species kind of won. So unfortunately, the zebra mussel did win here. And one species will decrease in populations, right? In population numbers. So as a result of that, over time, what happens, and this doesn't happen in like a year or two, this happens over decades of time. So what happened over time, especially by the time now, 2020 arrives, the zebra mussel actually is now incorporated into the ecosystem of the Great Lakes. So that's the next part that I'm going to show you here. So we're looking at a food web. So just kind of the definition of a food web before I show it to you. A food web is essentially a picture representation of the feeding relationships for organisms in an ecosystem. So basically it shows who is eating who in an ecosystem. Okay, so at this point in time, the zebra mussel is now part of the food web of the Great Lakes. Other animals have found ways to eat it and live with it. So again, this does not happen overnight. So we're talking like many years have to pass for this to happen. So what ends up happening is the zebra mussel has now found its niche, although it is still in competition with the pearly mussel. So the pearly mussel basically is on the decline, and the zebra mussel has now won that competition. So let's take a look at the food web. So this is a typical, just like an example of a food web. It doesn't have to always be with these items. You're going to see when we talk about food webs in the next couple of lessons that you can have different food webs for any ecosystem. But they all kind of look the same. So I'm going to explain what's happening here. So basically you have a bunch of pictures of different organisms, and then there's arrows. Okay, so the direction of the arrows is very important. The arrow always points to who is eating that item. So for example, algae and small aquatic plants. You see how there's an arrow pointing into the zebra mussel? That means the zebra mussel is eating these algae and small aquatic plants. So same thing with, there's an arrow pointing to this snail over here. This snail is eating this small aquatic plant. The arrow pointing to the catfish is eating the algae. So think of it as the arrow is kind of where it's going into the mouth of. Like this algae is going into the catfish's mouth. This plant is going into the snail's mouth. Or you can see it continues on. So the catfish is being eaten by the walleye, right? So it's like a bigger fish. The walleye is being eaten by the loon. Or algae is being eaten by the duck. So it's kind of like a pattern that shows many different interactions with many different things. Now, from this, we can actually build a food chain. So food webs show a whole bunch of different food chains. So what a food chain is, let's maybe look at this here. So algae going to the zebra mussel, and then the zebra mussel is being eaten by this goby. Okay, so a food chain we can make from this could be algae is being eaten by the zebra mussel. Okay, and then that is being eaten by the goby. Right? So this is like one food chain. Okay, so food chains, a food web can be used to make many different food chains. So I'll kind of highlight the one that we just made here. Let's do that, right? Okay, so this is the food chain I just wrote down. Algae to the zebra mussel to the goby. Now, when you're making a food chain, you have to keep following the arrows until there is no more arrows. So another food chain that you can make from this, maybe I'll use a different color here to show you the different one, right? So maybe I'm going to go algae to the catfish, to the walleye, to the loon. All right, so here's another food chain, right? So let's do another one. Okay, so I can say small aquatic plants to the snail, to my crustacean here, and then I can go to the catfish, to the walleye, to the loon. So you can have overlaps as long as if it is a different pathway and you follow it all the way to the end, that is a food chain. So there's many food chains. When you have a food web, you can make many different food chains. So for example, I can go algae to the duck. That is one food chain. Another food chain, let's do, maybe I'll highlight this. I can go algae to the zebra mussel to the hydra. All right, so here's another one. So a food web is essentially many different interactions being shown at once. Once you start looking at food chains, right? Food chains is only looking at one line of interactions. So it's a different concept. So this is a food web. Okay, so the last part here is looking at organization. So we have, actually I'm going to show you the summary page. You can go through this on your own after, but I'm going to use this picture to kind of explain it. Okay, so individual. So an individual is like one animal or one living thing on its own, right? So for example, a dog or, Sally's dog. This could be an oak tree, like one individual living thing. A population is looking at the entire amount of species, or should say the entire population numbers for one species. Remember, we looked at this term already. Community is looking at all the different species living within an ecosystem. So not just the birds, but the birds, the fish, the frogs, the different types of trees, everything all together. A biome is a larger ecosystem that's made up of many little ecosystems. So several different communities. And the main thing that makes up a biome is it has a specific climate. So meaning it has a similar temperature and a similar precipitation levels. So for example, the tundra is mostly made up of it's in northern Canada, the Arctic area. So it has many different communities there, but all together you can piece it together into one larger area, like geographically. Okay, and the biosphere is all the different components that are found on Earth. So basically any part of Earth where there are living things. Okay, and lastly here, so the biosphere requires 3 different parts for it to be sustained. The lithosphere, which is made up of our solid Earth, the hydrosphere, which is where you have all of the water components, and the atmosphere, which is the air. And that makes sense. What do living things? Well, we need a ground to stand on, we need water to survive, and we need air to breathe. So they kind of all interact, together for a living thing to be sustained.